Most people think WW2 started in 1939, but what if I told you the first spark was lit years earlier in a place almost nobody talks about today? It began with a headline so small, so unimportant looking, that the world simply glanced at it and moved on. A small article buried on page 6 of an international newspaper. A small report from a faraway region. A conflict that seemed too distant to matter. But history would later look back at that tiny news clipping and realize it was the first domino. The world in the early 1930s was tired. Tired of war, tired of poverty, tired of political drama. Countries were rebuilding after World War I, families were trying to survive the Great Depression, and most nations were focused inward. The last thing anyone wanted was to imagine another world conflict. But beneath the surface, something dark was rising. Germany was boiling. Not visibly, not loudly, but internally. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed the nation. Economy collapsed. Millions unemployed. National pride shattered. Anger isn't loud at first. It grows quietly. And that's exactly what was happening. At the same time, Japan, a rising empire hungry for land, resources, and power, was preparing for expansion. Italy, led by Mussolini, dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire. Russia was under Stalin's iron fist. Britain and France were exhausted superpowers hoping peace would magically hold. The stage was set. But the world was pretending not to see it. Then came the spark, a small military operation in a remote region of Asia. Newspapers covered it, but lightly. Politicians dismissed it. And ordinary people barely noticed it. Yet that single military move would begin a chain reaction, one that would eventually lead to the most destructive conflict in human history. The scariest part? The world had more than one chance to stop everything before it exploded. But each time, leaders hesitated, ignored the warning signs, or believed the danger would simply go away. It didn't. This chapter isn't about battles or tanks. It's about ignorance, the world convincing itself that the danger wasn't real. Every red flag was seen as not my problem. Every threat was minimized. Every dictator was underestimated. People didn't realize they were living in a countdown. A slow, silent, invisible countdown. Ticking toward a war more brutal than anything humanity had ever seen. And years later, when historians traced the beginning of WW2, they didn't point to the day bombs fell on Poland. They pointed to this moment. The moment the world looked away. When World War I ended in 1918, the world celebrated as if violence had vanished forever. Leaders from victorious nations gathered in Paris to shape a new future, one built on peace, stability, and justice. At least, that's what they claimed. But in the halls of Versailles, behind polished tables, carved walls, and grand speeches, something else was happening, something much darker. The victors weren't building peace. They were building resentment. Germany, the defeated nation, was blamed entirely for the war. The punishment was brutal. Staggering financial reparations. Loss of territories. A crippled military. National humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to stop another war. Instead, it planted the seeds for the next one. Imagine being a German citizen in the 1920s. Your country is bankrupt. Your money becomes worthless overnight. A loaf of bread costs a wheelbarrow full of banknotes. Parents burn currency in stoves because it's cheaper than buying firewood. And in that desperation, a new kind of leader emerged. A leader who said, "You are suffering because the world wants you weak. You deserve to rise again. You were not defeated, you were betrayed." His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler didn't rise because he was powerful. He rose because Germany was broken. The treaty had done more than punish, it had created the perfect storm. A defeated military. A starving population. A furious nation desperate for hope. Germany didn't need a hero. It needed someone to blame, and Hitler provided that. He weaponized national shame, transforming it into nationalism, revenge, and ambition. Meanwhile, the Allied nations believed they had secured peace. They didn't realize they had created a ticking time bomb. A nation pushed into humiliation will eventually fight its way out. The Treaty of Versailles was the most dangerous kind of mistake, a mistake wrapped in good intentions. Instead of healing the world, it deepened old wounds and created new ones. Historians now agree on one truth. WW2 didn't start with bullets. It started with signatures. When Japan started a war nobody called World War. Most people believe WW2 started in Europe. But the truth is more surprising and far more forgotten. The first real sparks of WW2 ignited not in Germany, not in Poland, but in Asia, nearly a decade earlier. The year was 1931. Japan, a rapidly modernizing empire, looked at the world and saw one thing. Not enough land. Not enough resources. Not enough power. While Europe was recovering from WW1, Japan had a different agenda. Expand. Conquer. Dominate. And that's when they turned their eyes toward Manchuria, a region rich in coal, farmland, and strategic roads. One night, a small explosion hit a railway track. It caused little damage, almost nothing. But Japan claimed it as an attack. Within hours, Japanese troops stormed Manchuria, launching a full-scale invasion. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an empire beginning to carve out a new world. But here's the twist. Nobody stopped them. The League of Nations, created to prevent another world war, did nothing. Not sanctions, not military action, not even a serious warning. Instead, they shrugged. It's a regional conflict. It's far from us. It doesn't concern Europe. This moment changed everything because Japan realized a secret. If the world won't stop us, we can take whatever we want. That confidence led to the invasion of China, massacres like Nanking, a Japan-Germany-Italy alliance, attacks across Asia-Pacific. Eventually, Pearl Harbor. The war in Asia was already raging long before Europe went up in flames, but Western textbooks rarely call this the beginning of WW2. Why? Because the world didn't take Asia seriously. They didn't think Japan's actions would affect them. But small fires, when ignored, become infernos. By the time Europe realized Japan's war mattered, the three major war fronts, Asia, Europe, and Africa, were already locked together. The world was already at war. Most nations just didn't know it yet. WW2 didn't start with one battle. It started with multiple wars slowly merging, like rivers swelling into an ocean. And Japan's invasion of Manchuria? That was the moment the current began. The night the pact was signed and millions were doomed. Europe was tense, unstable, and on the verge of disaster. Hitler wanted Poland. Stalin wanted time. And the world expected the two dictators to hate each other forever. But history isn't predictable. Sometimes enemies shake hands. And that handshake destroys millions of lives. On a warm August night in 1939, inside a room heavy with cigar smoke and political tension, representatives of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a secret agreement. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On paper, it looked like a simple non-aggression treaty. In reality, It was a deal to divide Eastern Europe like a cake. Germany would take Western Poland. The Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland. And both sides promised not to attack each other for now. This one signature changed everything. It meant Hitler was free to attack Poland without fear of a war on two fronts. It meant Stalin could expand his territory while pretending to stay neutral. It meant Britain and France, who promised to defend Poland, had no idea betrayal was already sealed. When news of the pact broke, the world gasped. How could the two biggest ideological enemies, Nazis and communists, suddenly become partners? But dictators don't care about ideology. They care about opportunity. This pact wasn't about peace. It was about strategy, calculation, and cold ambition. And the worst part? Inside the agreement was a secret protocol, one the world wouldn't learn about for decades. A map, carefully drawn, showing exactly how Poland, the Baltics, Finland, and Romania would be carved up. Millions of people were about to lose their homes, their countries, their futures. Before a single shot was even fired. When Hitler invaded Poland days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was crushed from both sides exactly as planned. Exactly as signed. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't just a treaty. It was the moment WW2 became inevitable. Because the second two dictators agreed to divide Europe, peace died. The morning the world finally woke up. It was still dark when the first bombs fell. The sky over Poland erupted in fire, thunder, and smoke. Sirens wailed through the streets. Families ran for shelter. Soldiers scrambled in confusion. It was September 1st, 1939. The day textbooks call the beginning of World War II. But this chapter isn't about armies. It's about the world suddenly realizing the truth. The war had already started years ago. They were just too late to notice. Germany attacked Poland with a speed the world had never seen. A new style of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Planes bombed cities. Tanks tore through borders. Infantry followed like a storm behind the flames. Within days, Poland became a battlefield. Within weeks, Europe was collapsing. And on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Their promises to protect Poland had finally pulled them into conflict. This was the official beginning. The moment newspapers screamed, "World War declared." But behind the drama, a sad truth lingered. They should have acted earlier. They ignored Japan in 1931. They ignored Hitler's rise. They ignored invasions in Europe. They ignored the pact with Stalin. Now, all their warnings had come together in a single explosion. The world didn't suddenly enter war on September 1st. It simply woke up to a war already in motion. For Poland, that morning was the end of peace. For Europe, it was the collapse of denial. For the world, it was the beginning of the most devastating conflict in human history. Millions would die. Borders would change forever. Empires would fall. A new world would be born from ashes. But the scariest part? Everything that happened on that morning could have been prevented. If only the world had listened to the warnings.